Today I'm going to demonstrate for you how to sew a ladder stitch. Now a ladder stitch is the stitch that we use when we are working with soft sculpture, teddy bear making, any toy making. We use this stitch to close our openings. Okay, you can see I'm demonstrating here today on a little makeshift, a little mock arm like you would expect to see on a teddy bear, like this little one here. I'm demonstrating in felt. I'm going to give you a little tip before we start too. Before I've put this arm together, I've actually machined a tiny little zigzag stitch just to hold those edges so that we don't have any fraying. It's quite difficult working with a fabric that frays away. Doing a closing ladder stitch can become quite tricky. So we want to stabilise that first. So it's a little bit of effort previous, but it really pays off in the end. If you're working with fur, we usually treat those little openings first before we sew the arm or the leg together with a fray check or a fray stop. I recommend when you're working with fabric, as we are in this case, to keep the seams flexible by just using a little zigzag stitch. So that's why I've done that. Now we're going to begin. This little arm has been stuffed fairly firm. I'm going to use a darker thread so that you can see what we're doing here. The thread that we use needs to have some slip to it. So we need a very extra strong thread, but if it's got a bit of a slip, bit of a sheen to it, even better. So we start with a normal sized needle. There's a reason for that. And we put a gigantic knot in the end. There must be 6 knots on top of each other there. The reason for that is it's that knot that's going to hold our ladder stitch together. So here we begin. We've got a little opening at the top. I always slip my thumb just in. If you can, if you're working on something like this, you can get your thumb up under there. You can see that that's where the seam begins. And whatever your seam allowance was here, that continues to be your seam allowance when we're closing. So we're going to begin with our needle and we're going to come in at the seam allowance as close as we can to that end of seam there. So we're going to come in, put our needle through and pull all the way through. Normally, of course, you choose a thread that exactly matched your fabric. So now we're going to pull our thread across because we're going to cross over to the other side. Now what we want to do is pop our needle in straight across, same seam allowance. We're going to pop our needle in and then we're going to just travel it a little way down the seam, probably in this case around about 3 to 4 mils, and slip that. And it comes out on the same side. Okay, it's easier to see once we've done it. So you can see now we've got one little stitch across there. Remember our knot is there, so it's holding it. So we've come across, in and out again, and we're on this side. So now we're going to cross back over again. We're actually going to go back into the first hole where our little knot is. That's the reason for me using a smaller needle at this point, because we want that knot to hold. If we were using a big needle, going back in here, we could enlarge that hole to the point where our little knot might slip through. So we're going in again and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to travel down just a little, just about the 3 or 4 mil. Same seam allowance, and we're going to pull that one through. And what will happen as we go, we will be crisscrossing over and you can see that we'll be pulling that seam in. At this point, I usually find a ladder stitch works better with a thicker needle because we pull up, it'll slip through easier, it'll mesh together easier. So I'm just going to change my needle here for a slightly bigger one. So I've swapped my needle for a slightly bigger one. It's easier to handle and it makes a slightly larger hole, which means that our thread's going to slip through and knit that ladder stitch together well. So basically now what we do is we're just going to travel down the whole length of our opening, going back into the same hole. Keep your stitches even. This is important because you want it to mesh together evenly, otherwise you'll end up with some puckering. So we'll do a couple more. After you've done a couple, squeeze that seam in between your fingers and you can see that it really knits together well, considering that's a black thread. On a very light fabric you can see how much it can be hidden. So keep your stitches small and keep pinching it in as you go, keep adjusting as you go. So you can see that by using a slightly bigger needle, while it might be a bit annoying rethreading, it certainly makes that thread slip through easier. And if you keep pulling it up as you go, you won't end up with some bagging areas up here when you're finished. So we're going to keep travelling down until we get to the base, just like that. So now we've travelled down a little further and you can see that that's knitting together well. For the sake of demonstration, I've actually just changed my needle again so that I can show you that you can use a curved needle. If you're unfamiliar with a curved needle, these are where they come into their own. So I generally use a curved needle when I'm doing a ladder stitch because obviously the curve makes it so easy to hook it under. And because they're usually a thicker needle, that works well for the ladder stitch as well. Helps your thread slip through. And in the case of sewing up, a lot of openings aren't as straightforward as something like a little teddy bear arm at the back here. Sometimes we've got a seam that we have to close, which is perhaps it's concave, it goes in, and it can be quite tricky getting a straight needle in there. So this is where the curved needle comes into its own, and it's great, it's really useful there. And on something like on this little dog here, of course, working on a curve in the back, there's your closing seam, and of course a curved needle is just marvellous, just makes it so much easier. So we'll travel down till we get to the bottom and I'll show you how to close up. So now we've travelled all the way down to the bottom of our opening. We've got about one more stitch left to do. You can see that there is the beginning of our machine seam. So I'm going to pop in one last stitch that'll knit this together. So we'll pop that in. You can see that that's knit together very well, and even given the thread colour, that's a fairly neat finish there. Also, as you go, just another tip, if you find that your little arm or your body part is a little lacking in stuffing, of course you can just add some more filling as you go, perhaps with a little forceps tool like that, and plump it out as you go. It's much easier to ladder stitch an opening on a stuffed arm or leg which is packed quite firmly, because it actually holds the seam out for you, so remember that. Now this is our last stitch, so we've pretty much closed that off. We're just going to go back into that hole on that side, and I tend to just come straight out somewhere in the limb, and I'm going to make sure that that last stitch is really pulled in. I'm going to put my thumb on there to hold that one, and I'm going to go back into the same hole. And I like to come out when we're working with reinforced felt or fabric in 3D, we really need to hide those knots. So I find that coming out and doing a final holding knot right on the seam is usually the best spot to do it. So I'm just going to take a little stitch, arms and legs getting tangled up as they do. Okay, I'm going to put my needle through the loop just to make a little knot right on the seam there, and that way I can dive back in, come out anywhere else in the bear, and you can find you can pretty much pop that knot in and it's hidden within the seam. Again, you have to remember your thread colour would be exactly the same. That allows you just to snip your thread. Just give it a little pull, snip your thread, and of course your thread end is lost back into the arm. So you can see that the ladder stitch can be one of the most daunting stitches, and I have to say I've done millions. It's my least favourite stitch, and it's a stitch that requires careful time and a lot of practice, and I'm grateful that none of you got to see my first attempt. So lots of practice and you'll have it down pat. Alright, so that's how you do a ladder stitch. We'll see you next time.